When Abraham told everyone at the hospital board meeting that I was mentally unstable and needed professional help, he had no idea that 3 months later I would be the lead investigator exposing his medical malpractice scandal that would destroy his career forever. The look on his face when he realized the delusional colleague he tried to have committed was actually the one person capable of bringing down his entire empire. That moment made everything worth it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of conference room, sea buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh glow across the mahogany table where 12 of the city's most respected medical professionals sat in judgment. I remember every detail of that moment. The way Abraham Morrison's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against his leather portfolio, the subtle smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, the way his allies nodded in synchronized disapproval as he delivered what he believed would be the final blow to my career. "Colleagues," Abraham had said, his voice carrying that practiced authority that had made him the youngest department head in Riverside Medical Center's history, "I'm afraid we're dealing with someone who has clearly lost touch with reality. Dr. Samantha Rivers has been making increasingly erratic accusations, displaying paranoid behavior, and frankly, I believe she poses a risk to both our patients and our institution's reputation." The words hung in the sterile air like a death sentence. Around the table, faces I had once considered friendly grew cold and distant. Dr. Belinda Walsh, my former mentor, wouldn't even meet my eyes. Colin Patterson, the chief administrator who had once praised my research, was already reaching for his phone, probably to call security. These were people I had worked alongside for 8 years, people who had celebrated my groundbreaking work in pediatric neurology, people who had once called me brilliant. Now they were looking at me like I was a dangerous animal that needed to be contained. Abraham continued his character assassination with surgical precision. "The allegations she's been making about our clinical trial protocols are not just unfounded. They're the product of a mind that has clearly become detached from reality. Her behavior over the past months has been increasingly concerning. The late-night emails filled with conspiracy theories, the unauthorized access to confidential files, the confrontational attitude with nursing staff. Each word was carefully chosen, each accusation perfectly crafted to paint me as the unstable villain in his narrative. He had been building this case for months, I realized, gathering ammunition while I had been gathering evidence. The difference was that his ammunition was designed to destroy my credibility, while my evidence was designed to expose the truth. What Abraham Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the mentally unstable colleague they were so eager to dismiss had spent the last 18 months systematically documenting every irregularity, every suspicious death, every covered-up complication in the pediatric wing. What they saw as paranoid delusions were actually meticulously researched findings that would eventually bring down the largest medical malpractice scandal in the state's history. But in that moment, as Abraham's voice filled the room with his lies, I sat perfectly still and let him dig his own grave deeper with every word. "I've consulted with Dr. Eve Richmond, our staff psychiatrist," Abraham continued, and I watched as a woman I had once considered a friend nodded gravely from across the table. "She agrees that immediate intervention is necessary. We're recommending that Dr. Rivers be placed on administrative leave pending a full psychological evaluation." The trap was springing shut around me. But what Abraham couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. Every late night he dismissed as erratic behavior had been spent building an unshakable case. Every unauthorized file access had been carefully documented and legally obtained through proper channels he knew nothing about. Every conspiracy theory email had been a breadcrumb trail leading investigators straight to the truth he was so desperately trying to hide. Abraham had made the classic mistake of underestimating his opponent. He saw a female colleague who asked too many questions and assumed she was having a breakdown. He saw someone who challenged his authority and decided she must be delusional. He looked at my determination to uncover the truth and convinced himself it was mental instability. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to have committed was actually a forensic investigator who had been working undercover for the state medical board for the past year. As the meeting concluded and security was called to escort me from the building, I caught Abraham's eye one last time. He looked so satisfied, so certain of his victory. He believed he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his carefully constructed empire of medical fraud and patient endangerment. "This is for your own good, Samantha," he said as the security guards approached, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "You need help, and now you'll get it." I smiled then, a small, knowing smile that seemed to puzzle him. "You're absolutely right, Abraham," I replied calmly as I gathered my belongings. "Someone definitely needs help, and very soon they're going to get exactly what they deserve." The confusion that flickered across his features was delicious. He couldn't understand how someone who was supposedly having a mental breakdown could seem so composed, so confident, so triumphant. But Abraham Morrison had always been better at playing politics than reading people. If he had been better at the latter, he might have noticed that the unstable colleague he was having removed had been recording every word of this meeting. He might have wondered why someone experiencing a psychological crisis would seem so prepared for this exact scenario. He might have asked himself why I looked less like a defeated victim and more like someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as intended. 3 months later, when the headlines would scream about the medical malpractice scandal that brought down Riverside Medical Center's Golden Boy, when the FBI would arrest Abraham Morrison on charges of fraud, negligent homicide, and conspiracy, when the families of 17 children would finally have justice for their lost loved ones, Abraham would remember that smile. He would remember the moment he called me mentally unstable, and he would realize that the only person who had truly lost their mind was the man who thought he could silence the truth by destroying the messenger. But that revelation was still 3 months away. In that conference room, surrounded by colleagues who had chosen reputation over truth, I was simply the mentally unstable doctor being escorted out of the hospital she had dedicated her life to protecting. What none of them knew was that the real investigation was just beginning, and the woman they had just dismissed as delusional was about to prove exactly who had really lost their grip on reality. The game had been set in motion years ago. Abraham Morrison just didn't know he was already 3 moves away from checkmate. It had started 18 months earlier with a simple question that Abraham Morrison should have answered honestly. Instead, he chose to lie, and that lie would eventually cost him everything. I was reviewing patient files in the pediatric neurology unit when I noticed the pattern. Emma Rodriguez, age 7, had come in for a routine procedure to remove a small brain tumor. The surgery was supposed to be straightforward, a minimally invasive technique that Abraham had pioneered and promoted throughout the medical community. Her parents had chosen Riverside Medical Center specifically because of Abraham's reputation and his revolutionary approach. Emma died 3 days after surgery from complications that, according to her file, were unforeseeable and unavoidable. But as I dug deeper into the records, comparing her case to similar procedures performed over the past 2 years, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Emma wasn't an isolated tragedy. She was the 7th child to die from unforeseeable complications, following Abraham's innovative surgical technique. 7 children. 7 families destroyed. 7 deaths that somehow never made it into Abraham's published research or conference presentations about his groundbreaking methodology. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning. I brought my concerns to Abraham. I still believed we were on the same side. I still thought he would want to investigate, to understand what was going wrong, to protect future patients. I walked into his office carrying a carefully prepared analysis of the cases, expecting a colleague who shared my commitment to patient safety. "Abraham," I said, spreading the files across his pristine desk. "We need to talk about the Martinez technique. I've identified some concerning patterns in patient outcomes that I think warrant immediate review." He barely glanced at the documents. "Samantha, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think you're seeing problems where none exist. Surgery always carries risks. We can't save every patient." 7 children, Abraham. 7 deaths with remarkably similar complications, all following the same procedure. The statistical probability of this being coincidental is essentially 0. That's when I saw it. The flash of something dark across his features. Not concern for the children, not professional, curiosity about a potential problem, but irritation, anger that I was questioning his work. "Are you suggesting," he said, his voice taking on that dangerous edge I would later know so well, "that my surgical technique is somehow flawed, that I'm responsible for these deaths?" "I'm suggesting we need to investigate. Look at the data. Objectively, maybe there's something we're missing, some factor we haven't considered. These families deserve to know." "These families," Abraham interrupted, standing up and moving around his desk to tower over me, "deserve to be left in peace to grieve, not to have their tragedy exploited by someone looking to make a name for herself by tearing down her betters." The words hit me like a physical blow. Exploited? Abraham, these are children who died. If there's even a chance that something preventable— There's nothing preventable about the inherent risks of neurosurgery, Dr. Rivers. And frankly, I'm concerned about your judgment in even suggesting such a thing. Perhaps you're not ready for the realities of working in a high-stakes environment. I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. This was the man who had mentored me during my residency, who had praised my analytical skills, who had specifically recruited me to his team because of my attention to detail. Now he was dismissing those same qualities as problematic when they inconveniently focused on his work. "Abraham, I'm not attacking you. I'm trying to protect patients. If we can identify what's causing these complications, the only complication— Here," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "is a junior colleague who doesn't understand her place. Let me be clear, Samantha. The Martinez technique is my life's work. It has saved hundreds of children and revolutionized pediatric neurosurgery. I will not allow it to be undermined by someone who lacks the experience to understand its complexities." I gathered the files from his desk, my hands shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. "So you're saying we should just ignore 7 dead children because it might inconvenience your research?" Abraham's face hardened into a mask of cold authority. "I'm saying that you should focus on your own work and leave the big picture to people who are qualified to see it. Unless, of course, you feel you're no longer a good fit for this department." The threat was clear. Shut up or lose your job. Accept the deaths or find yourself looking for new employment. It was a choice he probably thought would be easy for me to make. Career advancement or professional suicide over a cause I couldn't win. He was wrong. As I left his office that day, carrying files that documented the preventable deaths of 7 children, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. Abraham Morrison thought he had successfully silenced a troublesome colleague with threats and intimidation. He believed his reputation and authority would protect him from any further scrutiny. He had no idea that the woman walking out of his office was someone who had spent years learning to navigate corrupt systems, someone who understood that the only way to defeat institutional power was with institutional power of your own. He didn't know that Dr. Samantha Rivers had connections beyond Riverside Medical Center, resources beyond her hospital salary, and a determination that he had just transformed from professional concern into personal mission. That afternoon, I made a phone call that would set everything in motion. The number belonged to Carol Henderson, an old friend from medical school who now worked as a senior investigator for the state medical board. We had stayed in touch over the years, often sharing war stories about the challenges of working in a system that too often prioritized politics over patients. "Carol," I said when she answered, "I need to report a serious pattern of patient safety violations. And I think I'm going to need protection." Protection from what? From someone who just made it very clear that exposing the truth could cost me my career. There was a long pause before Carol spoke again. "How serious are we talking?" 7 dead, children serious. And a department head who just threatened me for asking questions about it. Jesus, Sam. Are you sure about this? I looked down at the files in my lap, thinking about Emma Rodriguez and the 6 other children whose families would never know that their deaths might have been prevented if someone had been willing to ask the right questions. I'm sure. The only question is whether we're going to do this the easy way or the hard way. Abraham Morrison had made his choice when he chose to threaten me instead of investigating the deaths. Now I was making mine. He thought he had eliminated a problem. Instead, he had just created his worst nightmare, someone with nothing left to lose and everything needed to win. The catalyst moment was complete. The game had officially begun. What Abraham Morrison didn't know about Dr. Samantha Rivers could fill a classified file cabinet, and soon it would. The modest apartment I rented 15 minutes from the hospital was carefully curated to appear exactly as everyone expected. The living space of a dedicated but unremarkable pediatric neurologist. Medical journals stacked neatly on the coffee table, a few family photos, some basic furniture that suggested a woman focused entirely on her career with little time for personal luxuries. Anyone who visited, which was rare by design, would see exactly what I wanted them to see. They would never notice the nearly invisible modifications to the home office, the specially installed soundproofing, or the fact that the decorative mirror on the wall was actually one-way glass concealing sophisticated recording equipment. They certainly wouldn't suspect that the woman they knew as a soft-spoken hospital employee had another life entirely, one that existed in the shadows of institutional corruption and medical fraud investigation. My real credentials were hidden, behind layers of bureaucratic paperwork and need-to-know classifications. While Abraham and his colleagues saw Dr. Samantha Rivers, pediatric neurologist with an unremarkable background from a state medical school, the truth was far more complex. My undergraduate degree in forensic psychology from Georgetown had been followed by specialized training at the FBI Academy in Quantico. My medical degree, while real, had been earned while working as a federal consultant on cases involving medical malpractice and healthcare fraud. For the past 8 years, I had been what the federal government called a deep placement asset. Someone inserted into high-risk medical institutions to monitor for patterns of abuse, fraud, or negligence that traditional oversight might miss. My assignment to Riverside Medical Center hadn't been random. The hospital had been flagged by multiple agencies for statistical anomalies in patient outcomes, unusual insurance claim patterns, and complaints that seemed to disappear into administrative black holes. Abraham Morrison's department had been of particular interest to my handlers. His rapid rise to prominence, combined with certain financial irregularities in his research funding, had triggered multiple red flags in federal databases. My job was to get close enough to determine whether those flags represented actual wrongdoing or simply the normal chaos of a busy medical center. The 7 dead children had answered that question definitively. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Carol Henderson, though her real title wasn't senior investigator with the state medical board. Carol was my federal handler, a 20-year veteran of healthcare fraud investigation who had been tracking patterns of medical abuse across the country for longer than most people had been practicing medicine. Status report needed. Priority. Alpha. I activated the secure communication system hidden behind what appeared to be a routine medical database interface. Within seconds, I was connected to a network that spanned federal agencies, state medical boards, and international healthcare, oversight organizations. Rivers checking in, I typed into the encrypted chat. Target has moved to active suppression phase. Threat assessment escalated. Details? I quickly summarized my conversation with Abraham, including his threats and his absolute refusal to investigate the pattern of deaths. What I didn't include in the report, what I couldn't include, was how his dismissive attitude had transformed this from a professional investigation into something much more personal. Recommend immediate activation of Phase 2 protocols, I continued. Target is now actively obstructing investigation and intimidating personnel. Pattern of negligent homicide confirmed. Understood. Phase 2, authorization granted. Full surveillance. Package approved. Additional assets being deployed to your location. Additional assets. That meant the investigation was about to expand beyond what Abraham could possibly imagine. Within days, every aspect of his professional and personal life would be under scrutiny by people who made their living exposing medical fraud. His financial records, his research data, his communications, his travel patterns. Everything would be analyzed by experts who had taken down healthcare criminals far more sophisticated than Abraham Morrison. But the federal investigation was only part of what Abraham should have been worried about. Over the years, I had built relationships throughout the medical community that went far beyond my official role. Nurses who trusted me with information about irregularities they'd witnessed. Laboratory technicians who knew which test results seemed questionable. Administrative staff who noticed when certain records went missing or were modified after the fact. None of them knew about my federal connections, but they all knew Dr. Samantha Rivers as someone who actually listened when they reported concerns about patient safety. Someone who took their observations seriously instead of dismissing them as gossip or troublemaking. Abraham's mistake was assuming that his authority within the hospital hierarchy gave him control over information flow. He had no idea that the mentally unstable colleague he was so eager to discredit had spent years building a network of eyes and ears throughout every level of the institution. Eve Richmond, the staff psychiatrist who had so readily agreed with Abraham's assessment of my mental state, was particularly useful in this regard. What Abraham didn't know was that Eve and I had developed a professional relationship that went far beyond our official interactions. She had been troubled by certain patterns she'd observed in the psychiatric evaluations Abraham had requested over the years. Evaluations that seemed designed more to silence problematic staff members than to address genuine mental health concerns. He's done this before, hasn't he? I had asked her during one of our carefully casual conversations in the hospital cafeteria several months earlier. I can't discuss specific cases, Eve had replied, but her expression told me everything I needed to know. But let's just say that Dr. Morrison seems to have very strong opinions about which staff members are psychologically suited to their positions. Now, as I sat in my hidden command center reviewing the files that would eventually destroy Abraham's career, I thought about all the people he had silenced over the years. All the nurses, technicians, residents, and junior physicians who had noticed irregularities but had been intimidated into silence or pushed out of their positions through psychiatric evaluations that questioned their stability and competence. Abraham Morrison had built his empire on a foundation of medical negligence and systematic intimidation. He had perfected the art of using institutional power to silence anyone who threatened his carefully constructed reputation. For years, it had worked perfectly, but he had never encountered someone like me, someone who looked like just another physician, but was actually a federal investigator with the resources and authority to bring down corrupt medical institutions, someone who appeared to be isolated and vulnerable, but was actually connected to a network of professionals dedicated to exposing exactly the kind of abuse Abraham specialized in. The game Abraham thought he was playing, institutional politics, and career advancement, was actually something much more dangerous. He just didn't know it yet. as I prepared my preliminary report for the federal task force that would soon descend on Riverside Medical Center, I allowed myself a moment of anticipation. Abraham Morrison believed he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his operation. Soon, he would discover just how wrong he was. The path that led me to become a federal medical investigator began with another doctor's lies, another institution's cover-up, and another family destroyed by medical arrogance. But that tragedy had belonged to me. My younger sister Lily had been 15 when she started experiencing severe headaches and vision problems. Our parents, both teachers with modest insurance coverage, had taken her to the local hospital in Boise, our small Ohio town, where Dr. Benjamin Crawford assured them that teenage girls often experience these symptoms due to stress and hormonal changes. "She's probably just anxious about high school," he had said with that patronizing smile I would later recognize in Abraham Morrison's face. "Maybe some attention-seeking behavior. I'd recommend counseling rather than expensive neurological testing." For 3 months, while Lily's symptoms worsened and our parents begged for more comprehensive testing, Dr. Crawford maintained his diagnosis of teenage hysteria. He prescribed anxiety medication and suggested our family was overreacting to normal, adolescent challenges. When my parents insisted on seeing a specialist, Crawford warned them about doctor shopping and noted in Lily's file that the family seemed to have unrealistic expectations and possible psychological issues. By the time a brain tumor was finally discovered, it had grown beyond the point where surgery could help. Lily died 6 weeks later, her last conscious words being an apology to our parents for causing so much trouble. Dr. Crawford never apologized. He never acknowledged his misdiagnosis. When confronted with the evidence of his negligence, he simply shrugged and said that brain tumors in teenagers were rare and difficult to diagnose. The hospital's administration backed him completely, suggesting that our family's grief was making us look for someone to blame for an unavoidable tragedy. I was 21 years old, about to graduate with a degree in psychology, when I watched my sister die from a medical system that valued reputation over truth. That's when I decided to spend my life making sure other families never experienced what mine had endured. The FBI's healthcare fraud unit recruited me during my senior year of college. Agent Carol Henderson, who would later become my handler, had been tracking Dr. Crawford's pattern of misdiagnoses and had identified my sister's case as part of a larger investigation. When she approached me about joining their efforts to expose medical corruption, I didn't hesitate. "We need people on the inside," Carol had explained during our first meeting in a nondescript government building outside Washington. "Doctors who can recognize patterns that outsiders might miss. People who understand both the medical system and investigative techniques." The training was unlike anything I could have imagined. 3 years at Quantico learning forensic investigation, criminal psychology, undercover operations, and advanced surveillance techniques. Medical school came next, but with a curriculum designed to identify fraud, negligence, and systematic abuse within healthcare institutions. I learned not just how to practice medicine, but how to recognize when medicine was being practiced badly, and how to prove it in court. My residency had been carefully orchestrated by federal handlers who placed me in hospitals known for problematic practices. Each assignment taught me new techniques for gathering evidence while maintaining my cover as a regular physician. I learned how to document suspicious patterns without triggering administrative attention, how to build networks of informants among hospital staff, and how to prepare bulletproof cases that would survive the inevitable legal challenges from powerful medical institutions. By the time I arrived at Riverside Medical Center, I had helped expose corruption at 7 different hospitals across 4 states. Doctors had lost their licenses, administrators had gone to prison, and institutional practices had been reformed to prevent future abuse. But I had also learned that the most dangerous medical criminals were those who had perfected the art of hiding their negligence behind legitimate authority. Abraham Morrison represented the most sophisticated type of medical predator I had encountered. Unlike the obviously corrupt physicians who falsified records or performed unnecessary procedures for profit, Abraham had built his reputation on genuine innovation. His Martinez technique was revolutionary, and when performed correctly, it saved lives that previous surgical methods couldn't reach. The problem was that Abraham had become so convinced of his own brilliance that he refused to acknowledge when his technique failed. Instead of investigating complications that could lead to improvements, he simply classified them as unavoidable and continued operating. Each failure was dismissed as an acceptable risk, each death reframed as an unfortunate, but inevitable outcome. What made Abraham particularly dangerous was his ability to silence criticism through institutional politics. Unlike other corrupt physicians who relied on crude intimidation or obvious cover-ups, Abraham used psychological manipulation and professional gaslighting to discredit anyone who questioned his methods. He had perfected the art of making legitimate concerns appear to be personal attacks or signs of mental instability. The 7 dead children weren't accidents or unavoidable complications. They were the predictable result of a surgeon who had stopped learning from his failures and an institution that protected his reputation more than its patients. My job was to prove this pattern in a way that would survive the inevitable legal and professional challenges Abraham would mount in his defense. The federal investigation tools at my disposal were extensive, but required careful coordination to avoid exposing my identity. Financial surveillance could track unusual payments or research funding irregularities. Communication monitoring could identify attempts to suppress evidence or intimidate witnesses. Database analysis could reveal patterns across multiple institutions that individual hospitals might not notice. But the most powerful tool in my arsenal was something Abraham would never suspect: patience. Federal investigations moved slowly and carefully, building cases that were designed to be absolutely unassailable when they finally reached court. While Abraham was focused on short-term damage control and reputation management, I was documenting evidence that would stand up to years of legal scrutiny. My specialized training included advanced psychological profiling techniques that helped me understand how medical criminals thought and operated. Abraham fit a specific pattern: the narcissistic physician who had achieved early success and become convinced of his own infallibility. Such individuals typically responded to challenges with escalating aggression and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. This psychological profile had helped me predict Abraham's reaction to my initial questions about the patient deaths. His threats and intimidation tactics were textbook responses from someone who felt his authority being challenged by a subordinate. What he didn't realize was that every word of our conversation had been recorded and would eventually be used as evidence of his willingness to obstruct legitimate safety investigations. The specialized equipment in my apartment could analyze voice patterns for signs of deception, stress, and emotional instability. My recordings of Abraham would clearly show someone who was more concerned about protecting his reputation than investigating patient deaths. In contrast, my own voice patterns would demonstrate the calm professionalism of someone genuinely concerned about patient safety. Federal prosecutors loved cases where they could present clear audio evidence of defendants prioritizing self-interest over public safety. Abraham Morrison was about to provide them with exactly that kind of evidence, recorded in his own voice and documented with scientific precision. The foundation had been laid years ago with Lily's death. The training had been completed through federal programs designed to identify medical corruption. The tools were in place through institutional access and advanced surveillance capabilities. Now it was time to put all of that preparation to work. The basement level of my apartment building housed what appeared to be a small storage unit marked S. Rivers Medical Files. What it actually contained would have made Abraham Morrison's threats seem like playground taunts in comparison to the sophisticated operation he had unknowingly challenged. Behind the mundane metal door lay a command center that rivaled anything the FBI maintained in their field offices. 3 monitors displayed real-time data feeds from the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Network, a federal database that tracked suspicious patterns across medical institutions nationwide. Advanced audio analysis equipment could detect stress patterns and deception indicators in recorded conversations. Secure communication arrays connected me directly to federal task forces, state medical boards, and international healthcare oversight agencies. But the technology was only part of the operation. The real power lay in the network of relationships I had cultivated over 8 years of undercover work. Belinda Walsh, my supposed mentor in the pediatric neurology department, had no idea that her casual comments about administrative pressure to avoid unnecessary investigations were being systematically documented and cross-referenced with similar reports from dozens of other federal assets. She thought she was simply venting to a trusted colleague about the frustrations of working in a politically charged environment. Colin Patterson, the chief administrator whose phone call would supposedly bring security to remove me, was already under surveillance by federal financial crimes investigators who had detected irregularities in the hospital's insurance billing practices. His communications were being monitored through legal warrants that had been obtained months before my confrontation with Abraham. The nursing staff who had witnessed Abraham's aggressive responses to questions about patient complications didn't know that their observations were being compiled into a comprehensive pattern analysis. Nurse Benedict Torres had documented 3 separate incidents where Abraham had verbally attacked staff members who raised concerns about post-surgical complications. Nurse Carol Williams had recorded Abraham's explicit instructions to minimize documentation of certain surgical outcomes in patient files. Each piece of information seemed insignificant in isolation, but when combined through federal analysis protocols, they painted a clear picture of systematic patient safety violations and institutional cover-ups. My handler, Carol Henderson, coordinated a network that extended far beyond Riverside Medical Center. Federal medical investigators were embedded in hospitals across 17 states, all sharing information through encrypted databases that could identify patterns no single institution would notice. Abraham's technique had been used at 4 other medical centers, with similar complication rates that local administrators had dismissed as acceptable risks. The sophisticated analysis revealed something even more disturbing. Abraham had been systematically selecting patients whose families were least likely to pursue legal action if complications arose. Children from low-income families, patients whose parents didn't speak English fluently, families with limited education who would be intimidated by medical authority, a deliberate pattern of targeting the vulnerable. Federal financial surveillance had identified unusual patterns in Abraham's research funding as well. Pharmaceutical companies developing neurological medications had provided substantial grants for studies that seemed designed to validate the Martinez technique rather than objectively evaluate its safety. The money trail suggested that Abraham's reputation was being artificially maintained through financial relationships that created conflicts of interest he had never disclosed. The recording equipment in my apartment had captured something even more valuable than Abraham's threats during our confrontation. My secure system had been monitoring all hospital communications for months, using legal surveillance warrants that allowed federal investigators to track suspicious activities. Abraham's phone calls immediately after our meeting revealed a pattern of behavior that prosecutors would find extremely compelling. He had contacted 5 different colleagues to discuss my mental instability, each conversation revealing his strategy for discrediting anyone who questioned his methods. He had called the hospital's legal department to inquire about procedures for removing problematic staff members through psychiatric evaluations. Most damaging of all, he had reached out to contacts at other hospitals where he had previously worked, apparently checking to ensure that similar concerns hadn't been raised at those institutions. The sophistication of the federal investigation would have shocked Abraham if he had understood its scope. Advanced behavioral analysis software was processing every documented interaction he had with patients, staff, and administrators. Voice stress analysis was being performed on recordings of his surgical consultations with families, revealing patterns of deception when discussing risks and outcomes. Financial forensics teams were analyzing his personal and professional accounts, research funding, speaking fees, and investment portfolios. Digital forensics specialists were examining his electronic communications, computer usage patterns, and database access logs. Even his travel records were being scrutinized to identify potential connections to other suspicious medical practices. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the investigation was the psychological profiling being conducted by federal behavioral analysts. Abraham fit a specific pattern of medical criminal that the FBI had been studying for decades. Highly intelligent, professionally successful, narcissistically convinced of his own superiority, and increasingly willing to take risks to maintain his status. Such individuals typically escalated their behavior when challenged, making increasingly desperate attempts to silence criticism and maintain control. The psychological profile predicted that Abraham would respond to my questioning with threats, intimidation, and attempts to have me removed from the hospital through claims of mental instability. His behavior was following the predicted pattern, with remarkable precision, providing federal investigators with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to build an unshakable case. The network I represented wasn't just investigating Abraham Morrison. It was part of a comprehensive federal effort to identify and eliminate systematic corruption within American healthcare institutions. Every hospital, every physician, every administrator who participated in patterns of patient abuse or medical fraud was being cataloged and investigated through resources that most medical criminals never imagined existed. Abraham Morrison thought he was facing down a single colleague who had asked inconvenient questions. In reality, he had just declared war on a federal task force that had been preparing for this confrontation for years. The secret world he had unknowingly entered was about to demonstrate exactly why medical criminals eventually lost every battle. They tried to fight against institutional justice. The framed photograph on my desk showed 7 children smiling at birthday parties, school events, and family gatherings. Emma Rodriguez with her gap-toothed grin, Marcus Thompson celebrating his 6th birthday, Sarah Chen building sandcastles at the beach. These weren't case files or statistics. They were real children whose lives had been cut short by medical arrogance disguised as innovation. But there was an 8th photograph I kept in my wallet, one that no colleague at Riverside had ever seen. Lily, my sister, taken just weeks before her death, still trying to smile despite the headaches that were killing her. That picture reminded me every day why this work mattered beyond federal investigations and criminal prosecutions. The healthcare system had failed these children not through incompetence or lack of resources, but through something far more insidious: the systematic silencing of anyone who dared to question medical authority. Abraham Morrison hadn't killed these children through malicious intent. He had killed them through narcissistic indifference to evidence that challenged his professional ego. This pattern extended far beyond Riverside Medical Center. During my years of federal investigation, I had documented how medical institutions consistently protected prestigious physicians over vulnerable patients. Nurses who reported safety concerns were labeled difficult and transferred to different departments. Residents who questioned established procedures were subjected to increased scrutiny and negative evaluations. Junior physicians who raised pattern concerns found themselves facing disciplinary action for insubordination. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed to protect institutional prestige over patient safety. Emma Rodriguez's parents, Maria and Carlos, had trusted Riverside Medical Center because of Abraham's international reputation. They had researched his technique extensively, read his published papers, and felt confident they were giving their daughter the best possible care. The night before Emma's surgery, Maria had thanked me personally for being part of the team that would save her daughter's life. 3 days later, I watched Maria collapse in the hospital corridor when Abraham delivered the news that Emma had died from unforeseeable complications. His tone was clinical, professional, carefully devoid of any personal responsibility for the outcome. He spoke about surgical risks and unavoidable consequences, while a mother's world disintegrated in front of him. What Maria Rodriguez never knew was that Emma's death followed the exact same pattern as 6 previous children. The same surgical approach, the same critical complication points, the same ultimate failure of a technique that Abraham refused to modify despite mounting evidence of its flaws. Her daughter had died not because brain surgery was inherently risky, but because Abraham Morrison was more committed to defending his reputation than improving his methods. The federal investigation had revealed something even more disturbing about Abraham's psychological profile. Advanced analysis of his patient consultations showed that he deliberately selected cases that would enhance his professional standing rather than cases where his technique would be most beneficial. Children with less complex conditions that could be treated with conventional methods were subjected to his experimental approach because successful outcomes would generate better research publications and conference presentations. Emma Rodriguez had been an ideal candidate for conventional surgery with a high probability of complete recovery. Abraham had chosen to use his Martinez technique not because Emma needed it, but because her case would provide good data for his next research paper. She had died to feed his academic ambitions. This realization had transformed my federal assignment from professional duty into personal mission. The children in those photographs deserved more than bureaucratic justice. They deserved someone who understood that behind every medical malpractice case was a family destroyed by preventable tragedy. My own family's experience with Dr. Crawford had taught me that medical institutions were expert at protecting themselves through legal technicalities and professional solidarity. Crawford had never faced meaningful consequences for misdiagnosing Lily's brain tumor because the medical establishment had closed ranks around him. Hospital administrators had cited standard diagnostic protocols and acceptable medical judgment to shield him from accountability. The difference now was that I possessed the federal resources and investigative authority that my family had lacked 15 years ago. Abraham Morrison would face the kind of comprehensive investigation that Dr. Crawford had avoided, conducted by professionals who specialized in exposing medical corruption and institutional cover-ups. But this wasn't just about punishing Abraham Morrison. The Federal Healthcare Fraud Task Force was working to dismantle an entire system of medical abuse that prioritized professional prestige over patient welfare. Every successful prosecution sent a message to other physicians that patient safety violations would be exposed and punished regardless of professional status or institutional protection. The recordings of Abraham threatening my career for asking about dead children would be played in federal courtrooms, where juries would hear exactly how medical authorities responded to legitimate safety concerns. The financial evidence of his research funding irregularities would demonstrate how pharmaceutical money influenced medical practice in ways that compromised patient care. Most importantly, the families of those 7 children would finally learn the truth about why their loved ones had died. They would discover that their children's deaths weren't random medical tragedies, but preventable outcomes of a physician's refusal to acknowledge the limitations of his technique. Maria Rodriguez would learn that Emma's death could have been avoided if Abraham had been willing to use conventional surgical methods appropriate for her condition. The other 6 families would discover that their children had died as part of a pattern that Abraham had deliberately concealed from medical oversight authorities. The emotional weight of carrying this knowledge, knowing that children had died, while their families trusted the very system that had failed them, drove me through the long hours of evidence compilation and strategic planning. Every encrypted communication with federal task force members, every surveillance recording of Abraham's continued deceptions, every piece of financial evidence linking his research to pharmaceutical funding was another step toward justice for families who had been denied the truth. Abraham Morrison thought this was about protecting his professional reputation from a troublesome colleague's accusations. He had no understanding that this was about fundamental justice for children who had died because medical authority had become more important than medical truth. The photographs on my desk and in my wallet would guide every decision I made in the coming months. 7 children plus my sister Lily. 8 lives that demanded accountability from a system that had protected their killers through institutional arrogance and professional solidarity. That accountability was coming, and it would be more comprehensive than Abraham Morrison could possibly imagine. The federal surveillance authorization arrived at 3:47 a.m., delivered through encrypted channels that bypassed all traditional hospital communication systems. Judge Patricia Hawkins had reviewed the evidence of systematic patient safety violations and signed warrants that would give federal investigators access to every aspect of Abraham Morrison's professional and personal life. Within hours, Abraham's world was being dissected by specialists who had perfected the art of exposing medical corruption. Financial forensics analyst Eve Martinez began tracing the flow of research funding from pharmaceutical companies to Abraham's various accounts. The initial analysis revealed patterns that would have impressed organized crime investigators. Research grants structured to avoid disclosure requirements, speaking fees channeled through multiple intermediaries, and investment opportunities offered exclusively to physicians who promoted specific drug therapies. Abraham had received $2.3 million over 5 years from companies whose medications were specifically prescribed for patients recovering from his Martinez technique. The financial relationship created obvious conflicts of interest that he had never disclosed to patients, hospital administrators, or medical journal editors who published his research. But the money trail revealed something even more disturbing. Abraham had been systematically selecting patients whose conditions would require the most expensive post-surgical medications, generating maximum revenue for his pharmaceutical partners while exposing children to unnecessary risks from experimental procedures. Digital forensics specialist Colin Baker analyzed Abraham's electronic communications, uncovering a deliberate pattern of evidence suppression and witness intimidation. Email records showed that Abraham had contacted colleagues at his previous hospitals to ensure that similar complications hadn't been reported to medical licensing boards. He had instructed research assistants to exclude certain patient outcomes from published studies, claiming they represented statistical outliers that would confuse readers. Most damaging were Abraham's communications with hospital administrators about staff members who had raised safety concerns. He had systematically recommended psychiatric evaluations for nurses, residents, and junior physicians who questioned his methods, using mental health assessments as weapons to silence legitimate criticism. The pattern was identical to what he had attempted with me, but federal investigators now had documented evidence of at least 12 previous cases where Abraham had used claims of psychological instability to remove staff members who threatened his operation. Behavioral analyst Belinda Foster developed a comprehensive psychological profile that revealed Abraham's methods for maintaining control over his department. He deliberately hired junior staff members who were vulnerable to intimidation, physicians with significant educational debt, nurses supporting large families, residents from foreign countries whose visa status depended on hospital employment. When these vulnerable employees discovered problems with his surgical outcomes, Abraham would threaten their financial security or immigration status to ensure their silence. He had perfected a system of institutional exploitation that made reporting his misconduct professionally suicidal for anyone dependent on hospital employment. Federal medical investigators conducted parallel analyses at the 4 other hospitals where Abraham had used his Martinez technique. The results were devastating. 31 children had died from complications following his procedures across all 5 institutions. Local administrators at each hospital had dismissed the deaths as acceptable surgical risks, never realizing they were part of a systematic pattern of medical negligence. The multi-institutional analysis revealed Abraham's strategy for avoiding detection. He would perform enough successful surgeries to maintain statistical credibility, while systematically concealing complications that revealed flaws in his technique. When questioned about patient deaths, he would cite overall success rates that included conventional procedures performed by other surgeons, making his experimental technique appear safer than it actually was. Advanced voice stress analysis of Abraham's recorded patient consultations showed clear patterns of deception when, discussing surgical risks with families, his voice exhibited stress indicators whenever he claimed that conventional surgical methods wouldn't be effective for specific patients. Lies he told to justify using his experimental technique for cases where standard procedures would have been more appropriate. The recordings revealed that Abraham was essentially using vulnerable children as test subjects for research that would enhance his professional reputation, while lying to their families about the necessity of experimental procedures. Surveillance teams monitoring Abraham's current activities documented his increasingly desperate attempts to control information flow within the hospital. He had begun conducting meetings in locations outside the medical center, apparently concerned about electronic surveillance of hospital communications. He was pressuring staff members to sign additional confidentiality agreements that went far beyond standard medical privacy requirements. Federal investigators recognized these behaviors as typical responses from medical criminals who sensed their operations were being scrutinized. Abraham's psychological profile predicted he would escalate his control tactics as pressure increased, providing additional evidence of his willingness to obstruct legitimate investigations. The intelligence gathering also revealed Abraham's plans for expanding his experimental technique to other medical centers. He was negotiating partnerships with children's hospitals in 3 major cities, arrangements that would expose hundreds of additional children to procedures with documented safety problems. Federal Task Force Coordinator Carol Henderson synthesized the intelligence into a comprehensive threat assessment that painted a clear picture. Abraham Morrison represented an ongoing danger to pediatric patients across multiple institutions, and his pattern of evidence suppression made traditional medical oversight ineffective. The evidence was overwhelming, but federal prosecutors needed more than pattern analysis to ensure successful prosecution. They needed Abraham to demonstrate his willingness to obstruct justice in real time, providing undeniable proof of criminal intent that would survive challenges from expensive defense attorneys. That's when the task force activated Phase 2 of the investigation, strategic provocation designed to make Abraham reveal the full extent of his criminal behavior, while federal surveillance captured every incriminating word and action. The intelligence gathering had revealed Abraham's vulnerabilities and criminal methods. Now, it was time to use that knowledge to build an unshakable case that would finally bring justice for 31 dead children and prevent future victims of medical arrogance disguised as innovation. Abraham Morrison thought he was dealing with a single troublesome colleague who had asked inconvenient questions. Federal investigators knew they were targeting a sophisticated medical criminal whose operation extended across multiple states and threatened children throughout the healthcare system. The reconnaissance phase was complete. The trap was ready to spring. The war room assembled in the basement of a nondescript federal building 20 miles from Riverside Medical Center looked like something from a spy thriller. 8 federal investigators, 3 prosecutors, 2 behavioral analysts, and a federal judge connected via secure video link to coordinate the most complex medical fraud takedown in the state's history. Carol Henderson stood before a wall-mounted display showing Abraham Morrison's network of corruption across 5 medical institutions. Red lines connected pharmaceutical funding to surgical decisions, patient deaths to research publications, and intimidated witnesses to administrative cover-ups. What had started as my investigation of 7 dead children had evolved into a federal case involving organized medical fraud, witness intimidation, and systematic patient abuse. Morrison represents a new type of medical criminal, Carol explained to the assembled team. Traditional healthcare fraud involves billing scams or unnecessary procedures for profit. Morrison's operation is more sophisticated. He's using experimental medical techniques as cover for research fraud, while systematically silencing anyone who threatens to expose his methods. Federal prosecutor Adam Williams reviewed the evidence structure that would anchor their legal strategy. We have three primary criminal charges: healthcare fraud through the pharmaceutical funding scheme, obstruction of justice through witness, intimidation, and negligent homicide through continued use of procedures he knew were causing patient deaths. The psychological warfare component would be my responsibility. Abraham's behavioral profile indicated he would escalate his intimidation tactics when he felt threatened, providing additional evidence of criminal intent. My role was to apply strategic pressure that would force him to demonstrate his willingness to obstruct justice while federal surveillance captured every incriminating action. Morrison's greatest vulnerability is his narcissistic need to maintain control. Behavioral analyst Dr. Sarah Chen explained via video link from FBI headquarters. When his authority is challenged, he responds with increasingly desperate measures. We need to create situations where he feels compelled to commit additional crimes while trying to cover up his existing misconduct. The strategy would unfold in three carefully orchestrated phases, each designed to escalate pressure while providing Abraham with opportunities to incriminate himself further. Phase 1 involved my return to Riverside Medical Center with federal protection, officially challenging Abraham's psychiatric evaluation through legal channels. This would force him to defend his claims about my mental stability, while federal investigators monitored his communications for evidence of witness tampering and evidence destruction. Dr. Eve Richmond, the staff psychiatrist who had supported Abraham's assessment of my mental state, would be approached by federal agents who would reveal the true nature of my background and mission. Her reaction to learning she had been manipulated into supporting a false psychiatric evaluation would provide crucial testimony about Abraham's methods for silencing critics. Phase 2 would involve the strategic release of information about federal investigation into patient deaths at multiple hospitals where Abraham had worked. This wouldn't directly implicate him, but would create pressure from hospital administrators, medical licensing boards, and pharmaceutical companies concerned about their exposure to criminal liability. The psychological analysis predicted Abraham would respond to this pressure by attempting to destroy evidence and intimidate additional witnesses. Federal surveillance would capture these obstruction activities, providing prosecutors with real-time evidence of criminal behavior. Phase 3 would be the most psychologically devastating. The gradual revelation that several key people in Abraham's professional network were actually federal informants who had been documenting his activities for months. The betrayal of trusted colleagues would trigger the kind of desperate behavior that typically led medical criminals to make fatal mistakes. Belinda Walsh, my supposed mentor, had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators after learning about the scope of Abraham's crimes. Her insider access to department meetings and administrative discussions would provide crucial evidence about institutional cover-ups and systematic patient abuse. Nurse Benedict Torres, who had witnessed Abraham's aggressive responses to safety concerns, would testify about the pattern of intimidation that kept medical staff from reporting legitimate problems. His detailed documentation of specific incidents would demonstrate how Abraham maintained control through fear and professional threats. The financial investigation would accelerate during this phase, with federal agents conducting surprise audits of research accounts and pharmaceutical company relationships. Abraham's reaction to financial scrutiny would reveal the full extent of his money laundering operation and provide evidence of tax evasion charges that carried severe federal penalties. Most importantly, the families of deceased children would be contacted by federal victim advocates who would explain that their loved ones' deaths were being investigated as potential criminal homicides rather than medical malpractice. This information would be strategically leaked to create media pressure that would make it impossible for Abraham to continue operating normally. The strategy included contingency plans for every possible response Abraham might attempt. If he tried to flee the jurisdiction, federal marshals were prepared to arrest him at airports or border crossings. If he attempted suicide, psychiatric specialists would intervene to ensure he survived to face trial. If he tried to destroy evidence, Digital forensics teams had already secured copies of all relevant materials. Advanced psychological modeling predicted Abraham would initially respond with increased aggression and intimidation, then progress to panic-driven attempts at evidence destruction, and finally collapse into desperate bargaining when he realized the scope of federal evidence against him. Each phase was designed to provide multiple opportunities for Abraham to commit additional federal crimes while believing he was successfully covering up his existing misconduct. The strategy would transform him from a perpetrator trying to avoid detection into an active criminal creating new evidence of his guilt in real time. Federal Judge Patricia Hawkins had pre-approved emergency warrants for any additional surveillance or seizure activities that might become necessary as Abraham escalated his criminal behavior. The legal framework was already in place to capture and prosecute whatever crimes he committed while trying to escape justice. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Give Abraham Morrison enough rope to hang himself while federal investigators documented every moment of his professional and personal destruction. The war room meeting concluded with synchronized watches and encrypted communication protocols. Phase 1 would begin the next morning when I walked back into Riverside Medical Center with federal protection and legal authority to challenge every aspect of Abraham's operation. Abraham Morrison thought he had successfully eliminated the threat to his medical empire. Instead, he had triggered a federal investigation that would systematically dismantle everything he had built through years of patient abuse and institutional corruption. The strategy was set. The trap was ready. Tomorrow, Abraham Morrison would begin the process of destroying himself. At 8 a.m. sharp, I walked through the main entrance of Riverside Medical Center, carrying a leather briefcase that contained federal court documents, legal injunctions, and recording equipment that would capture Abraham Morrison's first steps toward his own destruction. The overnight transformation in my legal status had been remarkable. 12 hours earlier, I was supposedly a mentally unstable physician being escorted from the building by security. Now I was a federal investigator with court-ordered authority to access my office, review patient files, and conduct official interviews with hospital staff. Abraham's first mistake was waiting for me in the lobby. He stood near the information desk, perfectly positioned to intercept anyone entering the building, clearly believing that his psychiatric evaluation had permanently eliminated the threat I represented. The expression on his face when he saw me walking purposefully toward the elevators was worth years of careful planning. "Samantha," he called out, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending authority. "I think there's been some confusion. You're not supposed to be here. Hospital administration has been very clear about your status." I turned to face him, allowing other staff members in the lobby to witness what would become the first recorded evidence of Abraham's obstruction of a federal investigation. The microphone concealed in my briefcase was already capturing every word of our conversation. "Dr. Morrison?" I replied, my voice calm and professional. "I believe you're the one who's confused. I'm here on official business related to a federal investigation into patient safety violations. Perhaps you'd like to review these court documents." I handed him the federal injunction that restored my access to hospital facilities and protected me from any administrative retaliation. As he read the legal language that stripped away his authority to control my presence at the hospital, I watched his face transition through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickering of genuine fear. "This is impossible," he muttered, scanning the document for some loophole that would restore his control over the situation. "You were evaluated by Dr. Richmond. The psychiatric assessment clearly indicated Dr. Richmond will be available. To clarify any misconceptions about that evaluation," I interrupted. "In fact, she'll be speaking with federal investigators later today about the circumstances surrounding her assessment." That was Abraham's first glimpse of the scope of what he was facing. The realization that his carefully orchestrated psychiatric evaluation was now part of a federal investigation into witness intimidation triggered exactly the response our behavioral analysts had predicted. His voice dropped to the menacing whisper I remembered from our previous confrontation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Samantha. This hospital has protocols for dealing with disruptive employees, and federal paperwork won't protect you from the consequences of interfering with legitimate medical operations." Perfect. Threat number 1, recorded with digital clarity that would later be played for federal prosecutors and ultimately a jury. Other staff members in the lobby were watching our interaction with obvious interest. Word would spread throughout the hospital, within hours, that Dr. Rivers had returned with federal authority, creating exactly the kind of institutional pressure that would force Abraham into increasingly desperate damage control measures. "Dr. Morrison," I said, loud enough for nearby staff to hear clearly, "are you threatening retaliation against a federal investigator conducting an official patient safety investigation? Because if so, I should probably mention that this conversation is being recorded for the Federal Task Force reviewing systematic violations of patient care standards." Abraham's face flushed red as he realized the legal trap that was closing around him. Every word he spoke was being documented as potential evidence of obstruction of justice. But his narcissistic rage prevented him from simply walking away from the confrontation. "You're making a serious mistake," he hissed. "This hospital, this department, my research, none of it is subject to harassment from someone who's clearly having psychological problems. I have contacts at the state medical board, federal oversight agencies, everywhere that matters in healthcare administration." Threat number 2, accompanied by claims of corruption that would trigger additional federal investigations into Abraham's network of political protection. He was essentially providing prosecutors with a roadmap of everyone who might be complicit in covering up his crimes. Nurse Benedict Torres approached from the elevator bank, drawn by the obvious tension of our confrontation. His presence was perfect timing. Another witness to Abraham's threatening behavior, and someone federal investigators had already identified as a crucial source of information about patient safety violations. "Dr. Rivers," Benedict said, his voice careful but relieved. "It's good to see you back. There have been some developments with the patients you were reviewing that I think you should know about." Abraham turned toward Benedict with barely controlled fury. "Nurse Torres, Dr. Rivers is not currently authorized to review patient cases. Any medical information you share with her would be a violation of hospital privacy policies." Benedict looked confused, clearly uncertain about the competing claims of authority. This was exactly the situation federal planners had anticipated. Abraham would be forced to choose between backing down from his intimidation tactics or escalating into obvious obstruction of a federal investigation. "Actually," I said, producing additional court documents, "I have federal authority to review any patient files related to ongoing investigations into systematic safety violations. Nurse Torres, please share whatever information you believe is relevant to patient welfare concerns." Abraham stepped between us, his body language aggressive and threatening. "No one is sharing anything with anyone until hospital administration clarifies the legal status of this situation. Benedict, you'll follow normal chain of command protocols or face disciplinary action for unauthorized disclosure of medical information." The confrontation was perfect. Abraham was simultaneously threatening a potential federal witness, obstructing an official investigation, and attempting to intimidate hospital staff into withholding information from federal authorities. Every word was being recorded for later use in criminal proceedings. "Dr. Morrison," I said, maintaining my calm professional tone, "you appear to be interfering with a federal investigation and threatening potential witnesses. I strongly suggest you contact your attorney before this conversation continues." That's when Abraham made his critical mistake. Instead of de-escalating or seeking legal counsel, his narcissistic rage drove him to assert dominance in a situation where he had no authority. "I don't need attorneys to deal with someone who's clearly experiencing a psychological crisis. Security will be removing you from this building immediately, and hospital administration will be filing complaints with whatever federal agencies think they have jurisdiction here." He reached for his phone, apparently intending to call security despite the federal court orders protecting my presence. The action demonstrated his willingness to violate federal authority to maintain control over his department. The first strategic move was complete. Abraham Morrison had responded to federal pressure exactly as predicted, providing documented evidence of obstruction, witness intimidation, and contempt for legal authority. Phase 2 could now begin, and Abraham had just provided prosecutors with perfect justification for escalating their investigation into every aspect of his operation. The security guards who responded to Abraham's call provided an unexpected gift to federal prosecutors. When they arrived in the lobby and saw the federal court documents protecting my presence, their supervisor immediately contacted hospital administration rather than attempting to remove someone with explicit legal authority to be there. Abraham's face contorted with rage as he realized his attempt to have me forcibly removed had backfired, creating additional witnesses to his efforts to obstruct a federal investigation. "This is unacceptable," he snarled into his phone, apparently speaking to someone in hospital administration. "I don't care what papers she's carrying. No one has the authority to disrupt my department without going through proper channels." The conversation was being recorded by federal surveillance equipment that had been legally installed throughout the hospital under the broad investigative warrants. Abraham was essentially providing real-time evidence of his belief that he was above federal law enforcement authority. Chief Administrator Colin Patterson arrived in the lobby within minutes, his expression carefully neutral as he reviewed the federal documents I presented. Unlike Abraham, Patterson understood the legal implications of interfering with a court-ordered investigation. "Dr. Morrison," Patterson said quietly, "I think we need to discuss this situation privately. Dr. Rivers, please proceed with whatever activities your federal authorization permits. Hospital security will ensure you have full access to appropriate facilities." Abraham's reaction to being overruled by hospital administration revealed the depth of his narcissistic delusion. He believed his reputation and departmental authority made him untouchable, even when faced with explicit federal court orders. "Colin, you're making a serious mistake," Abraham said, his voice loud enough for the growing crowd of staff members to hear. "This woman has been diagnosed with severe psychological problems. Any information she gathers will be tainted by her mental instability. The hospital's liability exposure could be enormous." Patterson's expression hardened as he realized Abraham was publicly questioning the mental health of someone with federal investigative authority. "Dr. Morrison, I strongly recommend you contact legal counsel before making any additional statements about this situation." But Abraham's rage had passed the point where rational advice could penetrate. He turned back to me, his voice dripping with condescension. "Samantha, whatever federal agency you've convinced to issue these papers, they clearly don't understand the medical complexities involved here. My research, my surgical innovations, the lives I've saved, none of that can be evaluated by someone who lacks the clinical expertise to understand advanced neurosurgical techniques." Perfect. Abraham was now questioning federal authority while claiming that his medical expertise exempted him from legal oversight. The recordings would demonstrate his belief that physicians should be immune from investigation by law enforcement agencies. Nurse Benedict Torres, who had been watching the confrontation with obvious interest, approached with a thick folder of documents. "Dr. Rivers, these are the patient files you requested last month. The ones Dr. Morrison said couldn't be released without additional authorization." Abraham moved to intercept the files, his body language aggressive and threatening. "Those documents contain confidential medical information that cannot be shared with unauthorized personnel, regardless of what federal papers anyone claims to possess." I accepted the files from Benedict while maintaining eye contact with Abraham. "Thank you, Nurse Torres. Federal investigators will review these materials as part of the ongoing patient safety investigation." Abraham's face flushed red as he realized he was powerless to prevent the release of information he had been desperately trying to suppress. This is a violation of patient privacy rights, hospital protocols, and medical professional standards. I'll be filing complaints with every regulatory agency that has jurisdiction over this situation." The threats were escalating exactly as federal behavioral analysts had predicted. Abraham was moving from simple intimidation to promises of bureaucratic retaliation against anyone who cooperated with the investigation. Dr. Eve Richmond appeared from the elevator bank, apparently summoned by the commotion in the lobby. Her presence created an opportunity for the next phase of psychological pressure, revealing to Abraham that his most trusted ally in the psychiatric evaluation scheme was about to become a federal witness against him. "Dr. Richmond," I said, pleasantly, "I believe you'll be speaking with federal investigators later today about the psychiatric evaluation you conducted. They're particularly interested in understanding the circumstances that led to your assessment of my mental stability." Eve's face went pale as she realized the implications of federal scrutiny of her professional judgment. Abraham looked between us, clearly sensing that another pillar of his defense strategy was crumbling. "Eve," Abraham said urgently, "don't let them intimidate you into questioning your professional judgment. Your evaluation was thorough and accurate. Any attempt to second-guess your psychiatric expertise is simply harassment." But Eve was smart enough to understand that federal investigators would have access to my real background and qualifications. Her psychiatric evaluation would be exposed as either incompetent or deliberately falsified, either of which could destroy her medical license. "Dr. Morrison," she said carefully, "I think I need to review the circumstances of that evaluation more thoroughly before discussing it with any federal agencies." Abraham's expression of betrayal was exactly what federal planners had hoped to achieve. His network of institutional support was dissolving in real time, as colleagues realized the scope of federal investigation and their own potential criminal liability. The lobby confrontation had accomplished everything Phase 2 was designed to achieve. Abraham had demonstrated his willingness to obstruct federal authority, threaten witnesses, and interfere with legal investigations. Multiple hospital staff members had witnessed his aggressive behavior and threats. His attempts to maintain control had backfired, creating additional evidence of criminal intent. But most importantly, Abraham was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed empire of medical fraud and institutional intimidation was crumbling. The psychological pressure was building toward the kind of desperate behavior that would provide federal prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of criminal intent. As I walked toward the elevator with the patient files that would document the scope of Abraham's crimes, I could hear him behind me making increasingly frantic phone calls to contacts who he believed could protect him from federal investigation. Those contacts were about to learn that attempting to interfere with a federal healthcare fraud investigation carried severe criminal penalties of their own. Abraham Morrison was about to discover that his network of protection was actually a network of potential co-conspirators who would be facing their own federal charges. Phase 2 was accelerating ahead of schedule, and Abraham's desperation was providing more evidence than federal planners had dared to hope for. The patient files Benedict Torres delivered contained exactly what federal investigators needed to destroy Abraham Morrison forever. Hidden among routine surgical reports was a smoking gun that even expensive attorneys couldn't explain away. Buried in Emma Rodriguez's post-operative notes was Abraham's own handwriting. Modified approach due to research parameters. Conventional. Technique would have been safer but less valuable for publication data. Emma Rodriguez had died because Abraham chose experimental procedures over proven methods that would have saved her life. He had literally written a confession of medical murder. 12 additional children had been subjected to experimental modifications, with Abraham's notes explicitly stating changes were made to generate research data rather than optimize patient outcomes. He had been using children as test subjects while lying to their families. The federal task force moved into high gear. Within hours, coordinated raids executed at Abraham's home, private practice, and 3 pharmaceutical companies. Federal agents seized computers, financial records, and research files that would provide comprehensive evidence of systematic healthcare fraud. Abraham's reaction to learning about the raids was captured by hospital surveillance cameras. When Administrator Colin Patterson informed him about federal searches, Abraham's first response wasn't surprise. It was panic-driven attempts to contact co-conspirators and destroy evidence. "They can't do this," Abraham shouted into his phone. The research protocols were approved by the Institutional Review Board. Everything was legitimate medical investigation. But federal investigators had discovered Abraham systematically lied to the review board about his research methods. The board had approved studies of conventional techniques, not experimental modifications that increased patient mortality for publishable data. Dr. Eve Richmond arrived at my office that afternoon, her face ashen. "Samantha," she whispered, "I need to tell you what really happened with that psychiatric evaluation." Her revelation was devastating. Abraham had provided false information about my background, fabricated incidents of erratic behavior, and pressured her to reach predetermined conclusions about my mental stability. The psychiatric evaluation had been deliberate fraud designed to discredit anyone threatening his operation. "He told me you were making paranoid accusations about patient deaths," Eve explained. "He said you were becoming unstable and posed danger to patients." I believed him because he's always been so respected. Eve's confession provided federal prosecutors with direct evidence that Abraham manipulated psychiatric evaluations to silence critics. Combined with similar testimony from previous hospitals, it painted clear systematic witness intimidation through abuse of mental health procedures. Abraham's financial records revealed the full corruption scope. Beyond pharmaceutical funding, irregularities. Investigators discovered he had been billing insurance companies for conventional procedures while performing experimental techniques. He had defrauded both the healthcare system and families who trusted him. Most damaging was discovery of Abraham's private communications with pharmaceutical executives. Email records showed explicit discussions about manipulating research data to hide adverse outcomes and maximize apparent benefits of expensive post-surgical medications. One email exchange was particularly devastating. "We need to ensure mortality data doesn't interfere with FDA approval timelines. Can you adjust patient selection criteria to eliminate problematic cases from published results?" Abraham had been systematically falsifying medical research to help pharmaceutical companies gain regulatory approval for medications less safe than published studies indicated. By day's end, federal investigators had assembled evidence of healthcare fraud, research fraud, insurance fraud, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and negligent homicide. The major strategic strike was complete. Abraham Morrison's career was over, his criminal liability undeniable, and his victims would finally receive justice. The federal pressure campaign began at 6 a.m. with simultaneous actions across multiple states. As Abraham Morrison was having his morning coffee, federal agents were interviewing his former colleagues at 3 different hospitals. Pharmaceutical executives were being served with grand jury subpoenas, and medical licensing boards were receiving detailed reports about systematic patient safety violations. Abraham's phone started ringing before 7 a.m. Each call brought worse news than the last. Dr. Margaret Stevens from his previous hospital in Chicago was the first to betray him. When federal investigators presented her with evidence of the cover-ups she had participated in, she immediately offered to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her testimony would detail how Abraham had systematically concealed patient deaths and intimidated staff members who questioned his methods. The pharmaceutical companies moved even faster to distance themselves from Abraham's operation. Within hours of the federal raids, 3 major drug manufacturers issued press releases announcing the suspension of all research relationships with Dr. Abraham Morrison pending federal investigation. The companies that had funded his fraudulent research were now racing to avoid criminal liability for their roles in his schemes. Medical licensing boards in 5 states opened formal investigations into Abraham's credentials and clinical practices. The boards had access to federal evidence showing that Abraham had lied on licensing applications, falsified continuing education requirements, and systematically violated professional standards for patient care. Abraham's attempts to control the narrative backfired spectacularly. His hastily arranged press conference to claim innocence was interrupted by federal agents serving him with additional warrants for electronic communications. The image of Abraham being handed legal documents on live television became the defining moment of his public disgrace. The psychological pressure was precisely calculated to force Abraham into increasingly desperate behavior. Federal behavioral analysts had predicted he would respond to institutional abandonment by attempting to destroy evidence and silence remaining witnesses. They were right. Hospital surveillance captured Abraham making frantic after-hours visits to his office, apparently attempting to remove or destroy files that might incriminate him further. He was unaware that federal investigators had already secured copies of all relevant documents and were now simply documenting his obstruction of justice. His communications became increasingly panicked and legally damaging. Phone taps recorded Abraham promising financial payments to former colleagues if they would refuse to cooperate with federal investigators. He was actively committing additional federal crimes while trying to escape prosecution for his existing misconduct. The media coverage intensified daily. National news outlets picked up the story of the pediatric neurosurgeon who had used children as test subjects for pharmaceutical research. Families of Abraham's victims began speaking publicly about their losses, creating emotional pressure that made it impossible for any institution to continue defending him. Benedict Torres provided federal investigators with additional evidence of Abraham's witness intimidation tactics. He revealed that Abraham had threatened to have him deported if he ever spoke about the surgical complications he had witnessed. The threats had been made despite Benedict being a United States citizen, demonstrating Abraham's willingness to use any form of intimidation to maintain silence. Carol Henderson coordinated the pressure campaign from federal headquarters, ensuring that every aspect of Abraham's professional and personal life was systematically dismantled. His medical licenses were suspended, his research grants were terminated, his hospital privileges were revoked, and his assets were frozen pending criminal proceedings. The sustained pressure campaign achieved exactly what federal planners had intended. Abraham Morrison was transforming from a successful physician trying to avoid accountability into a desperate criminal, creating new evidence of his guilt with every action he took. Phase 3 could now begin, and Abraham was perfectly positioned for his final destruction. The American Medical Association's annual ethics conference was the perfect stage for Abraham Morrison's final humiliation. As one of the keynote speakers, he would address 3,000 physicians, medical researchers, and healthcare administrators about maintaining professional standards in innovative medicine, a topic that would soon become his personal nightmare. Federal investigators had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The conference would provide Abraham with one last opportunity to demonstrate his arrogance and contempt for ethical medical practice, while federal surveillance captured every incriminating word for use in criminal proceedings. Abraham's preparation for the conference revealed the depth of his delusion. Despite facing federal charges and institutional abandonment, he still believed his reputation and professional connections would protect him from serious consequences. His planned presentation included detailed descriptions of the Martinez technique, complete with patient outcome data that federal investigators knew was systematically falsified. Dr. Belinda Walsh, my former mentor who had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, would introduce Abraham's presentation. Her role was to create maximum psychological tension by praising his innovative contributions to pediatric neurosurgery, while knowing that federal agents in the audience would soon expose him as a fraud and killer. The conference organizers had no idea that dozens of federal investigators, medical fraud specialists, and digital surveillance experts would be attending Abraham's presentation. What appeared to be a routine medical conference was actually an elaborate federal operation designed to capture Abraham's final self-destruction on video. Abraham's behavior in the days leading up to the conference provided additional evidence of his deteriorating mental state and increasing desperation. Hospital security footage showed him making multiple unauthorized visits to departments where patient files were stored, apparently still trying to locate and destroy evidence of his crimes. His communications became increasingly frantic and legally damaging. Federal wiretaps recorded Abraham attempting to coordinate alibis with former colleagues, promising additional payments for false testimony, and making explicit threats against witnesses who had agreed to cooperate with investigators. The pharmaceutical executives who had funded Abraham's research were already negotiating plea agreements with federal prosecutors. Their testimony would reveal that Abraham had explicitly promised to manipulate research data in exchange for continued funding, making their relationship a clear criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate medical research. Media attention focused intensely on the upcoming conference presentation. Medical news outlets reported that Dr. Abraham Morrison would address questions about recent federal investigations for the first time since the raids on his offices. The coverage created exactly the kind of public pressure that would force Abraham to defend his reputation regardless of legal consequences. Federal prosecutors prepared arrest warrants that would be executed immediately after Abraham's presentation. The timing was designed to create maximum psychological impact. Abraham would experience his professional peak and destruction within minutes of each other. Carol Henderson positioned federal assets throughout the conference venue. Digital. Surveillance equipment would capture every word of Abraham's presentation, every facial expression when confronted with evidence of his crimes, and every attempt to flee or destroy additional evidence. The families of Abraham's victims would be watching the presentation via secure federal video links. After years of believing their children died from unavoidable medical complications, they would finally witness the man responsible for their losses being exposed as a criminal who had sacrificed their loved ones for personal gain. Dr. Eve Richmond, whose cooperation had been crucial in exposing Abraham's witness intimidation tactics, would be seated in the front row where Abraham could see her face. Her presence would serve as a psychological trigger, reminding Abraham that his most trusted allies had abandoned him for federal protection. The stage was set for Abraham Morrison's complete professional and personal destruction. His keynote, presentation about medical ethics, would become a public confession of systematic patient abuse, research fraud, and institutional corruption. Federal investigators had spent months preparing for this moment. Abraham Morrison had spent his entire career creating the evidence that would destroy him. The moment Abraham Morrison stepped onto the conference stage, he sealed his fate forever. 3,000 medical professionals watched as the man who had called me mentally unstable began what would become the most spectacular professional suicide in medical history. "Colleagues," Abraham began, his voice carrying that familiar arrogance, "recent allegations against my research have been driven by individuals who lack the expertise to understand innovative medical techniques. Today, I want to address these unfounded accusations and demonstrate why the Martinez technique represents the future of pediatric neurosurgery." He was magnificent in his delusion. Even facing federal charges, Abraham couldn't resist defending the procedures that had killed 31 children. Federal cameras captured every word as he essentially confessed to systematic medical malpractice on live television. "Some have suggested that patient deaths following my procedures indicate flaws in the technique," Abraham continued. "This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of acceptable surgical risk. Innovation requires physicians willing to push beyond conventional limitations." I watched from the back of the auditorium as Abraham Morrison destroyed himself with his own words. Federal investigators had hoped he would be arrogant enough to defend his actions publicly. but even they were amazed by the scope of his self-incrimination. Then came the moment we had all been waiting for. "Before Dr. Morrison continues," I said, walking toward the stage as federal agents moved to secure the exits, "I believe the audience should understand who they're really listening to." Abraham's face went white as he recognized my voice. The confident physician who had dominated the stage seconds earlier suddenly looked like a terrified criminal caught in the act. "Ladies and gentlemen," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "I am Dr. Samantha Rivers, federal investigator with the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Task Force. Dr. Morrison, you are under arrest for healthcare fraud, research fraud, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and the negligent homicide of 31 children." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. 3,000 medical professionals watched as federal agents surrounded Abraham Morrison, the man they had come to hear speak about medical ethics. Abraham tried to speak, but no words came. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his narcissistic delusion. The mentally unstable colleague he had tried to silence was actually a federal agent who had been building a case against him for months. Federal Agent Carol Henderson stepped forward with the arrest warrant. "Dr. Abraham Morrison, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As handcuffs clicked around Abraham's wrists, the large screens throughout the auditorium displayed evidence of his crimes. Patient files showing his deliberate use of experimental procedures on children who could have been saved with conventional surgery. Financial records documenting pharmaceutical bribes. Email communications revealing his systematic falsification of research data. The audience watched in stunned silence as years of systematic patient abuse and institutional corruption were exposed in devastating detail. The physician they had respected as an innovative leader was revealed as a criminal who had sacrificed children's lives for professional advancement. Abraham's legs buckled as the full scope of federal evidence was displayed for the medical community to witness. Dr. Eve Richmond, seated in the front row, looked away as the man who had manipulated her into providing false psychiatric evaluations was led away in handcuffs. "Dr. Morrison called me mentally unstable," I announced to the silent auditorium, "when I questioned why children were dying from his experimental procedures. Today, we've demonstrated who really lost their mind." The federal task force had achieved everything they had planned. Abraham Morrison's public arrest at his own ethics presentation would send shockwaves through the medical community, warning other physicians that patient abuse would be exposed and prosecuted regardless of professional status. As Abraham was escorted from the stage, he looked back at me one final time. The confusion and terror in his eyes told me he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. The woman he had dismissed as mentally unstable had systematically destroyed everything he had built through years of criminal medical practice. Sinamand. Great revelation was complete. Abraham Morrison's career was over, his freedom was gone, and justice for 31 dead children was finally beginning. The chaos that erupted in the auditorium after Abraham's arrest was unlike anything the medical conference had ever witnessed. 3,000 physicians, researchers, and administrators sat in stunned silence as federal agents secured the scene and began collecting evidence from audience members who had worked with Abraham Morrison over the years. Within minutes, major news outlets were broadcasting footage of Abraham being led away in handcuffs from his own ethics presentation. The image became the defining symbol of medical arrogance brought to justice. Social media exploded with reactions from the medical community, patient advocacy groups, and families who had lost loved ones to questionable medical practices. Dr. Belinda Walsh approached me as federal agents processed the scene. Her face was ashen with the realization of how completely she had been deceived by Abraham's reputation and manipulation. "Samantha," she whispered, "I need you to know that I had no idea about any of this. When he told me you were having psychological problems, I believed him because he seemed so concerned about patient safety." "I know, Belinda," I replied. Abraham was expert at manipulating people who trusted medical authority. That's exactly how he got away with killing children for so long. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of Abraham's institutional support network. Hospital administrators, research coordinators, and pharmaceutical executives who had enabled his operation were now scrambling to distance themselves from his crimes. Federal agents began serving subpoenas to anyone who had facilitated Abraham's research fraud or helped suppress evidence of patient deaths. Riverside Medical Center issued an emergency statement announcing the immediate suspension of all procedures using the Martinez technique. Hospital CEO Patricia Manning called an emergency board meeting to address their liability exposure and begin implementing reforms to prevent future patient abuse. The pharmaceutical companies that had funded Abraham's fraudulent research faced immediate stock price collapses as investors realized their potential criminal liability. Federal prosecutors announced that any corporation that had knowingly participated in falsifying medical research would face criminal charges and massive financial penalties. Most importantly, the families of Abraham's victims finally learned the truth about how their children had died. Federal victim advocates contacted each family personally to explain that their loved ones had been killed not by unavoidable medical complications, but by deliberate criminal negligence. Maria Rodriguez, Emma's mother, released a statement through her attorney. For 2 years, I blamed myself for not recognizing signs that might have saved my daughter. Today I learned that Emma died because a doctor chose his career advancement over her life. No parent should ever have to endure what Dr. Morrison put our family through. The medical licensing boards that had enabled Abraham's operation by ignoring previous complaints faced federal investigation for systematic failure to protect patients. 3 board members resigned immediately, rather than face questions about their relationships with pharmaceutical companies that had funded Abraham's research. Benedict Torres, the nurse whose courage had provided crucial evidence against Abraham, was placed in federal protective custody after receiving threats from unknown individuals who apparently wanted to silence his testimony. His safety concerns demonstrated that Abraham's corruption had extended far beyond his immediate medical practice. Dr. Eve Richmond faced immediate suspension of her psychiatric license pending investigation of her role in providing fraudulent mental health evaluations designed to silence Abraham's critics. Her cooperation with federal investigators would determine whether she faced criminal charges for participating in witness intimidation. The immediate consequences extended beyond individual accountability to systematic healthcare reform. Federal agencies announced new oversight protocols for experimental medical procedures, enhanced protection for medical whistleblowers, and mandatory reporting requirements for unusual patient mortality patterns. Abraham Morrison's arrest had triggered the largest medical fraud investigation in federal history. Over the following weeks, dozens of additional arrests would follow as investigators traced the full network of corruption that had enabled his crimes. The immediate aftermath of Abraham's public exposure achieved everything federal planners had hoped for. The medical community received an unmistakable message that patient abuse would be exposed and prosecuted regardless of professional status, institutional protection, or political connections. Abraham Morrison had transformed from respected physician to federal prisoner in less than 10 minutes. The man who had called me mentally unstable was now facing life imprisonment for systematic medical murder. The immediate consequences were just the beginning of Abraham's complete destruction. 3 years after Abraham Morrison's conviction and life sentence, the healthcare landscape had transformed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during his reign of medical terror. The federal investigation that began with 7 dead children had evolved into a comprehensive reformation of how medical institutions protect patients from physician abuse. The Morrison Medical Safety Act, signed into federal law 18 months after his arrest, established mandatory reporting systems for unusual patient mortality patterns, federal protection for medical whistleblowers, and criminal penalties for institutions that suppress evidence of patient safety violations. Every hospital in America now operated under oversight protocols designed to prevent another Abraham Morrison from using children as research subjects. Riverside Medical Center had undergone complete transformation. The pediatric neurology department was rebuilt from the ground up with new leadership, enhanced safety protocols, and a patient advocacy system that ensured families had access to independent medical opinions before experimental procedures. Dr. Patricia Manning, the CEO who had initially protected Abraham, was serving a federal prison sentence for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The pharmaceutical companies that had funded Abraham's fraudulent research faced billions in federal fines and criminal prosecutions that sent 12 executives to federal prison. The industry-wide reforms that followed included mandatory disclosure of all physician financial relationships, independent safety monitoring for all research protocols, and federal oversight of drug approval processes. My role had evolved from undercover investigator to director of the Federal Medical Safety Task Force, a permanent agency established to identify and eliminate systematic patient abuse within healthcare institutions. The task force operated with expanded authority to investigate suspicious medical practices and protect patients from physicians who prioritized personal advancement over human life. Benedict Torres had become a national advocate for patient safety, testifying before Congress about the systematic intimidation that prevented medical staff from reporting dangerous practices. His foundation provided legal protection and financial support for healthcare workers who risked their careers to expose patient abuse. Dr. Eve Richmond, whose cooperation had been crucial in exposing Abraham's witness intimidation tactics, had completely rebuilt her career around ethical psychiatric practice. She now directed a federal program that helped identify and rehabilitate healthcare workers who had been traumatized by participating in institutional cover-ups. The families of Abraham's victims had found purpose in their tragedy through the Morrison Foundation, which funded research into legitimate pediatric neurosurgical techniques and provided support for families dealing with medical malpractice trauma. Emma Rodriguez's parents established scholarship programs for medical students who committed to ethical patient care above career advancement. Abraham Morrison himself had become a case study in medical schools across the country. His crimes analyzed in ethics courses that taught future physicians about the devastating consequences of prioritizing professional reputation over patient welfare. His life sentence in federal prison served as a permanent warning to medical professionals who might consider placing personal advancement above human life. The transformation extended beyond policy changes to fundamental shifts in medical culture. Healthcare institutions now prioritized transparency over reputation protection, patient advocacy over physician authority, and systematic safety monitoring over trust in individual medical judgment. Medical conferences that once celebrated innovative techniques without questioning patient outcomes now required comprehensive safety data and independent ethical review before presenting new procedures. The days when charismatic physicians could silence critics through intimidation and institutional protection were permanently ended. Most significantly, the investigation had revealed that Abraham Morrison's crimes were not unique. Federal task forces identified similar patterns of patient abuse at 17 other medical institutions, leading to additional prosecutions and systematic reforms that protected thousands of patients from experimental procedures disguised as innovative medical care. The lasting transformation achieved something Abraham Morrison had never imagined possible. His criminal legacy became the foundation for the most comprehensive patient protection system in medical history. Every child who would be protected by the reforms he had made necessary represented a victory for justice over medical arrogance. Abraham Morrison had intended to silence one troublesome colleague who asked inconvenient questions about dead children. Instead, he had triggered a permanent transformation that would protect patients for generations to come. 5 years later, I stood before a congressional committee investigating healthcare reform, carrying with me a photograph that had guided Every decision I made since that first confrontation with Abraham Morrison, 8 children smiling at cameras, unaware their lives would become the foundation for protecting countless others from medical predators who disguised ambition as innovation. The lesson of the Morrison case, I testified, is not just about one corrupt physician or one failed institution. It's about what happens when we allow authority to silence truth, when we prioritize reputation over accountability, and when we forget that the most dangerous criminals are often those who hide behind the most respected credentials. The committee room was silent as I described how a simple question about dead children had exposed systematic corruption that extended across multiple states and institutions. Abraham Morrison's crimes had been enabled not by criminal conspirators, but by ordinary people who chose institutional loyalty over moral courage. Every nurse who stayed silent about suspicious deaths, every administrator who suppressed safety concerns, every colleague who dismissed legitimate questions as personality, conflicts, they all participated in Abraham Morrison's crimes through their willingness to look away from inconvenient truths. The universal principles revealed by Abraham's downfall extended far beyond healthcare. In every profession, every institution, every community, there are Abraham Morrisons, individuals who accumulate power through competence and charisma, then use that power to silence anyone who threatens their carefully constructed image. The most important lesson, I continued, is that the people who call you mentally unstable for asking difficult questions are often the ones who have lost their grip on reality. They live in worlds where their authority exempts them from accountability, where their expertise justifies any action, where their reputation matters more than the lives they destroy. Maria Rodriguez sat in the gallery, now a federal patient advocate whose work ensured that other parents would never endure what Abraham Morrison had put her family through. Her presence reminded everyone in the room that behind every case of institutional corruption were real people whose lives had been shattered by preventable tragedies. The truth Abraham Morrison had tried so desperately to suppress was actually quite simple. No one is above accountability, no matter how respected their position or impressive their credentials. The medical degrees, research publications, and professional accolades that had protected him for years became meaningless when confronted with systematic evidence of his crimes. Abraham Morrison called me mentally unstable because I asked why children were dying from his procedures, I concluded. Today, he's serving life in federal prison while the safety protocols we implemented have saved thousands of lives. Sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one thinking clearly. The congressional hearing marked the 5th anniversary of Abraham's arrest and the completion of healthcare reforms that had transformed patient protection throughout America. The Morrison Medical Safety Act had prevented dozens of similar cases from developing, identifying problematic physicians before they could harm patients, and ensuring that institutional cover-ups were no longer possible. But the most important, legacy wasn't legislative or institutional. It was personal. Every healthcare worker who now felt empowered to report safety concerns, every patient who received honest information about treatment risks, every family that avoided unnecessary tragedy because someone had the courage to ask difficult questions. They all represented victories over the culture of silence that had enabled Abraham Morrison's crimes. The photographs of 8 children who died because medical authority was more important than medical truth would always remind me why this work mattered. Their deaths had exposed systematic corruption that threatened thousands of other children, and their legacy would protect patients for generations to come. Abraham Morrison had called me mentally unstable for questioning his authority. History would remember him as the criminal, whose downfall proved that the most dangerous people are often those who silence the voices asking the most important questions. Sometimes being called crazy is the highest compliment you can receive. It means you're the only one brave enough to speak truth to power. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.